I just want to have a look at a couple of buildings and a couple of murals. So this area here is important because it was actually originally owned by the Methodist Church, and it's where the sort of Black Theatre happened within Redfern, which was really important in terms of spurning out a lot of material, but it was also an important meeting place. Finally, through a series of wound up organisations, ended up with the Indigenous Land and Sea Corporation, who basically designed and built this building primarily for Koori Radio, but it now also has the offices of Tribal Warrior, who are very important in this community. The front of this building is basically based on a book called The Cherry Pickers, and it's an Adam Hill Black Douglas design. This mural's only recent, and it's basically a mural of the founding women who founded Wyanga. So Wyanga was an Aboriginal care program. It is particularly aimed at trying to do appropriate Aboriginal aged care. And I want you to also have a look on the side here at a huge mural. So this here is based on a drawing of the Mission Boy Dreams, based on a work by Roy Kennedy. This building, like a number of others, were updated by and made fit for purpose for Aboriginal organisations with funding from the Indigenous Land and Sea Corporation, who basically was set up to provide funds for organisations that weren't going to get anything out of the land rights claims. So Cracknell and Lonigan involved in a number of the buildings around this place as architects, and they were involved also in the work that was done at Wyanga and then putting this mural in place. This here is the first power station in Sydney. Redfern was the third municipality in Sydney, and they went and had a look at what was happening in other places and decided that the area would greatly benefit by having a power station rather than having to run on gas. This here is the building where that power station was. So quite often when we think about things that are changing now, it's also important to understand some of that sort of heritage of the area, and something like this in a time when we're having conversations about how we power cities and stuff like that is just useful to know is there. The building on the corner is the old post office. It was bought by the City of Sydney for a cultural centre. One of the things about Redfern is that because it's the home of a whole pile of Aboriginal organisations, you have sort of histories of families and clans and all sorts of people that sort of feed into that sort of process. So it might not surprise you, or it might, that welcomes to country are contested spaces in Redfern. Many of the Aboriginal organisations that have grown up in the area were pretty stunned when they got a letter from Metropolitan Land Council that said under the New South Wales land rights law, we're the only ones that are allowed to do welcomes to country and none of you can. I think that the city's way around that is it has an agreement with Metro and recognises them as a land council, but it also has an Aboriginal advisory committee that it draws more broadly from within the community so that it has a series of voices. Metro would take the view that that's surplus government land and should go to Metro. Other people in the community say no, there needs to be a broader community conversation about that. So you have some organisations like Wyanga, Tribal Warrior, etc., that are in a group called the Empowered Communities grouping that work with people in La Perouse around trying to do stuff in the area. But that is sort of not something that some other organisations that would see themselves in a more radical tradition would feel happy with. We're in front of the old Catholic Presbytery, where a guy by the name of Ted Kennedy came as a priest and was very involved in doing stuff within the local community. It's now Redfern Durham College, but Ted worked very much with Mum Shirl and a number of people within the community around giving refuge to homeless Aboriginal people, to kids, etc., and tried to take the Catholic Church on a bit of a journey. The old Rachel Foster Hospital site, which has been turned into housing, took an awful long time. First site sold by the RWA, and it took 10 years or so to develop. The Department of Communities and Justice have just taken a head lease on some of that for social housing. And then in tipping your hat to the marriage equality debate is this mural here, which is Tony Abbott marrying Tony Abbott. That we're just coming into, Boxley Swamp as it was. So it was a swamp. Part of the importance of this area to the Aboriginal community was that it had lots of food because it had sort of sandhills and swamps. So this was a major swamp that then basically got turned over to be a park. The War Memorial here is like war memorials in many parks, but it's important because one of the things that started to happen back in 2006 or so was that people started to think about Aboriginal soldiers and the whole black digger thing. So there was a big push to memorialise the contributions of Aboriginal people. So they went off to war, came back, couldn't go into the RSL clubs, weren't entitled to take soldiers' settlement blocks. The stuff that they actually had sort of experienced when they were soldiers as being equal to everybody else wasn't there when they came back after the war. But there were an awful lot of Aboriginal people, both from the Boer War onwards, that actually joined up in the army. So one of the things that Redfern has done over time is actually to commemorate that. Redfern Park is sort of famous for Keating's speech, but it's also important sort of meeting place for during the bicentennial for the big march. All the Aboriginal part of that march actually met at this site. It's always been an important sort of middle ground, if you like, in the days of sort of suburban lines and demarcations. The fact that you had Redfern Oval over there was the common place where people from around the area could come together. Redfern Oval itself was the home for South Sydney for ages, and then after they were kicked out of the NRL, there was a big push to turn this into a large stadium, and there were grandiose plans to put car parking underneath. And but that again was another great big battle between the football club and locals about whether or not you could put a car park in there that actually was going to take an hour and a half to clear after a game. And as I said, this is Boxley Swamp, so the water table sits just below the grass, and that's an issue for the next site we're going to have a quick look at, which is for the Elizabeth Street site where there's social housing going in. Looking back up this way is where you have the Redfern public housing estate. It basically started at the other side of the road and then goes up to the Three Sisters, the three tall towers at Redfern. The space in front of us is where there will be, it's public housing land, but it's where there'll be a new development go in on Elizabeth Street. The PCYC on this site, the plan is that that would be incorporated into this building. But the story of this site goes right back to 2003 when the South Sydney Council basically agreed to a proposal for a public-private development on the site. Part of the problem, however, was that you'd sort of step on the step of one of the buildings there and you'd watch the water come up between your toes, and they had it very difficult to come up with someone to do it. So in 2009, LAC built replaced the number of social housing units that they had on a new development at the back of this block, and this was left then for the private development. A little while ago, Land and Housing Corporation said let's do a build to rent on this process. The problem was that for that to be viable, they needed a huge density to go on it. And the planning control was with the City of Sydney, and the City of Sydney said, no, what you want is unrealistic. And they then came back with some planning controls that LAC didn't like, so they then said, well, build to rent's no longer feasible, we're going to have to do it as build to sell. It was won by a non-conforming application. So it was open to developer consortiums, which is the way in which LAC do that. In this case, a community housing provider called Bridge Housing put in their own proposal, which basically had them as the developer rather than a developer as the developer. And that meant that they could do a number of things that a developer couldn't do. So one of those things, for example, was to say, we're going to take our developer margin and we're going to turn that into affordable housing. Another thing they did was that they talked to institutional investors in terms of a superannuation fund and said, would you be interested in putting money into some units here for affordable housing? And they got agreement to that. It's only 10 years, but they're at this point in time looking for how they might extend that. And then the other element which is interesting, which links back to what's happening in Waterloo, is that there would be 90 odd social housing units that would go into this site. Now normally what would happen is that the community housing provider associated with the consortium would actually build and run that community housing. In this case, Bridge will build it, but they won't run it. And they won't run it because the consortium that they're part of with Frasers basically, when the new government changed the rules, basically said we can't make this viable, so they're pulled out of the race for Waterloo. And whoever the community housing providers are that wins Waterloo ends up with this site and the site above the metro site. So some good outcomes, but and also, I mean, Bridge are going to move their head office also back into this site. So really good outcomes from a non-conforming tender, but some sort of strange bits and pieces in the process. This is much more traditional. This is a conservation area, and it was a conservation area that has somewhere in the vicinity of 500 social housing units spread through it, some of which are newish in terms of basically done as a sort of infill, some of which are heritage buildings that continued to be used. When the Waterloo Towers were being built, there was a slum clearance process that was happening with the Housing Commission at the time. And so they issued all these notices to people that their places were being compulsorily required and that they needed to get out. That led to a huge uprising within the community. There is a film called Waterloo, done by a guy by the name of Tom Zabricki. I suggest you have a look at that because it documents what happened during that time and how the Green Band stopped the further development of the high rises that we see in Waterloo. But what it meant was that a lot of places had been compulsorily acquired that continued to operate as public housing. And the issue with public housing has been that you've had problems with maintenance as the sort of demographic have shifted, and over a period of time it's been easier for government here and in places like Glebe to actually sell those units off and to get money to be able to fund their operation. So the important thing to know about Land and Housing Corporation is it's a self-funded government entity. Michael Coutts-Trotter in 2014 said to a shelter conference, if you take out the stimulus packages, over the previous 10 years, we have been selling 2.5 public housing units a day just to keep the system running. Right? So the context that Communities Plus comes in is to try to find a way of being able to address some of that. Not necessarily particularly good because it had to operate within a self-funded type model, but it's useful to sort of look at a space like this as part of what's happened before, in the same way as you might look at what's happened with the high rises and say, you know, we're now being told we wouldn't do that anymore. That's not a good thing to do. We're going to do things totally different. And ask yourself the question, well, in 50 years' time, will people be saying the same thing about the developments that we're seeing at the present moment? How well have we really gone through that whole sort of discussion about what's appropriate for the way in which we develop these sort of sites? And that's a particular issue around public housing, where you've had this change over time from people being basically sort of working class housing under the sort of Menzies approach, where you basically, for those people that weren't going to have sufficient income to go and buy places, through to a situation where the stock was run down, there were rent to sell arrangements, stock wasn't replaced, and now you're in a situation where to be able to get access to public housing in the inner city, you have to have priority, which basically means you're coming out of homelessness or you've got other issues that actually you can substantiate to be able to get a hurdle that basically says you're needful enough to be able to get into public housing. And so that means that you've got a very different cohort coming into public housing than what you had in Anthony Albanese's day when he grew up in public housing. And quite often the fact that those series of government policies that have changed the nature of people in public housing and the supports that they need to be able to have a successful tenancies don't get factored into some of the redevelopment discussions. So you can have a high density development has been proposed for Waterloo, but is that, even if it was appropriate for a normal community, whatever that is in inverted commas, how does that work for people that are coming in out of homelessness, complex needs, mental health issues, and how does that part of it work? Alongside that, over a period of time, the actual supports for people coming in to public housing have actually dropped off. So that sort of priority thing has become much more like a high jump. You get all the doctor's reports and everything together, and then you and then you go. And if you're coming out of homelessness, all the homelessness services work with you until you've got a home, and then by definition you don't need them anymore because you're not homeless. And you've had people going in and not having the supports they need to be able to establish a successful tenancy. So that's one of the reasons why, from REDWatch side of stuff, there's a whole human services side of the work that needs to happen, because it's not just about what happens with the built environment, it's about what are the supports that are there for the cohorts that are coming in. And a whole pile of the issues we have in public housing boil down to clashes between people who are coming out of that old working class cohort that really want to live next to people like them, so they're quite happy for a salt and pepper mix, which LAC doesn't want because you can't work stratas and stuff like that in that sort of process. But then when one of them dies off, you're having somebody with a high and complex needs going into the middle of a floor, and a whole pile of disruption that comes from that. Some of that goes back to, you know, government being happy to accept the first Richmond report and not the second Richmond report, and a whole pile of other things, because both out of the prison system and out of health, people are just basically released and expected that somehow they're going to go back into, and they're not going to need support. So there's a whole series of, I'm a sociologist by training, there's a whole pile of social issues that are caught up with that, which just aren't built environment ones. But we think of public housing as these two estates, but there's 500 units in here, which are public housing that is spread throughout the conservation area that we also need to try and protect, otherwise they're out the door in the way in which Millers Point was out the door. About a paper called the South Sydney Herald, which was basically been around for 20 odd years. So it was originally put together to tell people's stories in the area, because Redfern has such a bad reputation. So the South Sydney Herald was very much about telling local stories. It continues to publish primarily because in the public housing, a lot of people don't have access to stuff online, so print edition is seen as being very important for that. You'll meet in a little while Norrie, who's the cartoonist for the South Sydney Herald, but it's an important part of the sort of the glue that sort of helps the community to tell its own stories. And just down here we'll pass past the factory, and that's Counterpart Community Services is the main organisation that deals with public housing tenants. Because of those quirks of government, it's funded primarily for early childhood intervention, and the bulk of people that are in public housing these days are not children or related to children, so the bulk of the people that walk through and use its services, they're not funded to deal with, but Family and Community Services basically funds these sort of centres for targeted early intervention rather than for dealing with public housing tenants and the issues that come along with that. The Cook buildings, which the 6 high-rises were about. At this point, this part of the site is not in what's been proposed for Waterloo. Initially, when they did the visioning for this site, both the metro site and the public housing were going to be dealt with together, and then in the end Metro got fed up. But what happened effectively was that the thing that drove the redevelopment of Waterloo was the fact that the metro station was going to go in there, and basically the standing orders that were operating basically said if you've got a bit of infrastructure like that going in, then that provides the basis on which you get the uplift to be able to redevelop it. So Brad Hazzard in 2015 proudly announced that you're getting the metro station and you're all going to be developed and you should be happy about it. The local community wasn't. There were people who put stuff in boxes expecting that something was going to happen. In fact, they were initially told that they could be moved within the first 12 months. The latest thing that's actually come out is that they won't be anybody moving until the beginning of 2025. So you've had a lot of people living in sort of suspense about what's going to happen in their places and with their life, and putting off buying a lounge or curtains or whatever to make their places more livable. These buildings were in the original concept plans that were being done, and it became a difference of opinion between the City of Sydney and LAC about whether or not the embedded carbon and what you could do with these buildings became an issue. So in the end, LAC pulled these buildings out of their proposal and just dealt with the low rise and the mid rise, and left the conversation here to a bit further down the track. But there's a whole conversation about are there things that can happen in terms of reblocking. The city's argument was potentially to break these into 2 separate buildings and to do some work. That's still ongoing conversation. But once that decision was made, the bulk of the tenants actually live in these. There's about 200 odd units in each building. So of the 2012 in the area, when those 6 buildings were pulled out, people said, look, the way this is going, I'm going to be dead before they actually get to, I don't have to worry about it. And then the focus moved to those people that were in the, within the walk-ups. The other thing that's important to say is that the green grass around you is actually, and again it takes back to stuff we heard yesterday, this green grass is LAC land. Right? It's not public. People can walk across it, but if you want to do an event on this, you have to get approval from LAC to be able to do it. And so it's all space that can be used for redevelopment. The proposal that has been approved will put a large park down near the new metro station. The expectation is that once that happens, all this will then, both here and over on Waterloo Green, will basically become buildings under the sort of proposal that's being looked at. So these are particularly attractive because they're relatively low density, lots of space around it, gardens. So even back in 2011, when the Sydney Metropolitan Development Authority were looking at it, their plan was basically to develop the walk-ups and to leave the high rises because that was too complicated. If you take the figures that are currently being used by government in terms of taking 30% of the walk-ups, you end up with a figure that gives you extra units, about 150 odd. If you take that exact same formula and you apply it to where the high rises are, you actually lose 350 odd units. Right? So we wait to see what they do differently, because if they just stick with this 30-70 mantra that they're doing, the figures don't stack up. You've got to actually increase the density here by 40% to be able to not lose public housing unit. So this is Karen and Norrie. Those people that sort of Google up Waterloo will have seen their faces on various articles. As I mentioned before, Norrie's the cartoonist for the South Sydney Herald that we were talking about earlier. Karen's involved also in Action for Public Housing, and both of them are involved in the human services conversation with government in the Waterloo redevelopment group, and are also involved on the REDWatch co-ord group. So they've been around this park for a while.
Okay, so the building I live in is up the other side of those, and it was built in 1967. It's got 56 units in it and a lovely courtyard. It has no lifts, even though it's 6 stories high, because the entry's in the middle. The nice thing about Waterloo Estate is that it is kind of an organic growth. So you have these older buildings and then some a little bit newer than that, and then some a little bit newer than that, the towers down that way, and then some a little bit newer than that, the Dobell and Drysdale up the hill there, which were the latest additions to it. And we've got, as you can see, these private additions, so they're quite nice, you know, they just fit in amongst it, and I think, you know, there's a possibility to do that rather than demolish everything that's here, because it's a lot of housing and there is a housing crisis. So we'd rather just not jump ahead on the housing list of the already massive housing list, and so apparently we're going to be a priority in front of the priority housing list. So I'd rather not do that. I'd rather hang on to these 749 homes for now until they actually build some more. And I think because it is a crisis, it's not just business as usual, and we might do something 15 years down the track, there'll be a bit more housing. The government should come up with some money, federal or state, I don't care. Federal's just announced a massive surplus, so let's take some of the already vacant land around down on Burke Street in Waterloo. There's a massive block of land which is waiting to get something built on it. And I really think the government should be stumping up the cash to build public housing. And, you know, we pay rent after all. They're going to get their money back. I've been paying rent for 32 years to them, so it's paid for anything that I cost them over and over again. So I just think that demolition and privatisation is the wrong way to go. Norrie?
Yeah, I was going to say, housing remains a good investment if you're just trying to cover the costs of the upkeep and maintenance. If you're trying to make an absolute mozza out of it, then public housing not such a good investment. But what is the motivation here? Is it to house people, or is it to make a mozza? This is not really high density, it's medium density. It's not light density, so it's fair. They've made fair use of the land, but there's still room for gardens. You still walk around here and see trees and gardens. We're not going to have that when they build huge towers. I've seen the plans, they come right out to the road or right to the pavement, so it's just concrete. You're not going to even see that little bit of grass there. People like to feed the birds. I know people put out food and water for them. What's going to happen to all those animals and the connections people have with the area and the things that live there when we have to flatten it all to build towers? And why do we need private investment in public housing. Housing is a good investment. A house does not deteriorate in value. Well, this is the biggest public house in Australia. Its crime stats are no worse than other suburbs. Sometimes it's a little bit less because the police do make sure nothing bad goes on here. They are out here regularly. They know what they're dealing with because, well, the people that are housed here, it's old age pensioners, people that have been in the area for ages, Aboriginal people, and some people that have come straight from jail, because the Department of Communities and Justice is in charge of both public housing and jails and the people coming out of there. So where will they house them? Oh, in the other part of our department. So we end up with colourful people, but people are just people at the end of the day. Whether or not they've got in trouble with the white man's law, we get on, we look after each other. I don't think it's a failed social experiment. I think it's a successful social experiment, because we're not just private renters blowing in and blowing out. When we're here, we're pretty much here for life, but 90% of us. And that means we have to get on with our neighbours and look after each other and form community. We walk along the street and we nod hi to each other, because we're not just blowings. We're here for the duration. We're committed to being here and being with each other.
Wow.